Welcome to day 18 of mobile app development. We are working our way through chapter 9. This will be our third day on it, third and last, unless something goes badly wrong. And the chapter is on dragging, collisions, timers, tables, and working with display groups. So it is a big chapter with a lot of examples. If you've looked through the course, the chapter resources, you'll notice, I've got a small set of examples in the main folder that's tied to the book, and I've tried to streamline the examples quite a bit. Also, two of the big examples from the keynote are the clover tap and the star jump examples, which I've broken out in separate videos. So if you didn't notice, there's videos for both of those activities, and they're actually pretty short, easy to follow, hopefully at least somewhat fun as well. So if you haven't done those, I'd certainly encourage you to do those. What I wanted to do today is start with just a fresh example and try to illustrate all the rest of the stuff in the chapter. All right, I know it's a big chapter, and if you were to try to look at all of the examples that I give you in the chapter downloads, it could take you weeks to work through them, but they're kind of fun. It's a fun chapter. It certainly moves us in the direction of stuff that's more game-like. All right, actually, let's start with something along the lines of timer activity 2. This first example just uses a timer to create star polygons and randomly locate them on screen and randomly set their grayscale and their size. So let's start with the polygon, and if you're following along, you certainly don't have to pick the star. If you do, that's how it's done. Edit the shape, select the star, update the points, and say OK. So we need a timer. I'm going to head to the Actions palette and add a timer. The timer is added to the stack with default settings. Repeats one time every second, which is perfectly fine, but I want the polygon now inside the timer handler. So I'm going to select the polygon object and hit the button Move Resource Into Function. There's only one function, so I'll say OK. And now what you see is we've got an app that when it starts, it creates and starts a timer, and after 1 second, it'll draw a star. So we can absolutely save it and test it. So I'm going to create a new folder for day 3, and I'll call it demo. Okay, let's generate the code and run it. And what you'll see is there's just a delay. There's a 1 second delay. And so there's about 100 millisecond delay to get the timer going. And then it waits 1,000 milliseconds and draws the star. So this is quite a bit short of where we need to go, but it's a great start. So if we wanted more stars, you could head over to the timer and say, if we want 10 stars, we could change this to 10. And this would be 1 per second. If we wanted to speed it up a bit, we could say, every half a second. So if we save it and run it again, what we'll see is apparently just 1 star. But if you look at the console, you can clearly see where the timer's run 10 times, and we know each time the timer runs, it's creating a star, and yet we're only seeing 1 star. So if that's a surprise, I'm not saying it is, but if it is, the reason is simply that the XY values for all the stars is the same. We put the star in the center of the display, so 160 over 240 down, and then we just created 9 more of them at the exact same location. So what you're looking at in the simulator is actually a stack of 10 stars on top of each other. So that's not what we want. We do want to randomize them. So heading back to the timer handler, the snippet. After we create the polygon, I'm going to need a snippet to manipulate the polygon, to change its X and Y values. So you could certainly just move the default snippet down, and for the sake of ease, that's what I'm going to do. So I just switch the locations in the stack so that the polygon's created first, and then the snippet here will run whatever code we want to run. As a first step, I want to change the XY values of the polygon. So the polygon is object 1, so I'll say object1.x equals, and then if we want to randomize it, we can use some of our random number generation skills and say math.random 320 is sometimes what we do, and object1.y equals math.random 480. So that should, I think, unless I made a mistake already. But all right, so if you're following along, you should get and I'll refresh that, or relaunch it. You should get an app which draws a nice collection of stars splayed out on your device. One star every half a second. Let me just hop back to the presentation for a second. In the example, you can see I'm also setting the stars to a color, a grayscale color, which makes them look cooler. The fill color is pretty easy, so we would just keep editing right where we're at. Let me add some comments. Randomize location. And now I want to randomize the fill color. So I'll say object1 : set fill color. And then I need some value between 0 and 1. Well, luckily that's exactly what math.random gives us. So I can just say set fill color math.random. To be able to see this, we will probably need some sort of a background, because some of these will be quite dark, and on the black background you probably won't see it. Just to be really quick, I'm going to add the snippet, which is gradient background, and move it up to the top. So let's save it, see if that got us something like we want. So yeah, that did grayscale the background. It does give us a splay of randomly located and randomly grayscaled stars that are more or less visible on that gradient background. So to do the scaling, I'm going to go back to the snippet that we've been editing, which is the event handling snippet under the timer event handler. All right, if I also want to randomize the size or the scale of object1, x scale. Okay, so this is doubling the x scale and the y scale. So instead of doubling it, let's randomize it and say math.random times 2 plus 0.5, something like that. I want them to use the same scaling. So I'll set object y scale to object x scale. That way we should get something now much closer to what's in the screenshot in the follow along activity. All right. The next activity in the keynote is essentially to add a counter. But to make it more visual, I'm putting the counter inside the star. So let's modify what we're working on and add a counter. While I'm at it, I like the way I did the example in the chapter better, where I have the shape outlined in a color that makes it stand out a bit better. Okay, and then I want a number in there. So numbers are just text display objects. So I'm going to add a text display object. It's showing up right there. So I'm going to change it to 0, and I'm going to start it out at black, and then we'll work on the color in just a second. I'm going to make it fit in the star. If I want the star and the counter to be grouped together so that when I do stuff to the group, it affects both the polygon and the counter, then I probably want a display group. So I'm going to create a display group. I'm going to call it star. So I'm going to put both of these in the timer handler. So I'm going to move the text into the function timer handler, and I'm going to move the star into the function timer handler. I'm doing that because I want to do all this each time the timer runs. Well, the way I'm going to do it, I want to create 10 stars that count up and display them on screen. So I want to be working in this snippet still, and I want that snippet after everything else is set up. So I'm moving it down so that it's still the last item in the timer handler. So the polygon gets set up, the text gets set up, and they're going to be grouped together. So I need to select the polygon and add it to the display group, and select the text and add it to the display group. So the text is not easy to resize. I'm going to get rid of the randomizing size or scale. There's a couple changes we're going to have to make. It's not going to work great because I'm randomizing the polygon, but not the text. And so if I want each new star to show up at a random XY location, I can't just set one of these. Luckily now we have access to the star display group, so I can, instead of setting object 1y and object 2y, I'm going to set star.x and star.y. So one of the complications though of display groups is that the x and y values mean something different. For almost everything else in Solr 2D, the x and y values locate the center of the shape on screen. That's not what display groups do. Display groups, the x and y tell Solr 2D how much to move the display group from its original location. So I've got the display group dead center in the screen, so its original location is 160 over and 240 pixels down. So this x and y value I give it here are relative to that location. It's really a delta x and a delta y instead of just xy. So if I use my normal math.random calculations you see directly above, it's going to push the star well past the right edge of the screen and well past the bottom edge of the screen, which I don't want. So I need to write these a little bit more carefully, and I'll say something like math.random. And so I want to go from the center of the screen over to the left or over to the right. And I want to go from the center vertically up to the top, so that would be 240 pixels up and as much as 240 pixels down. That should randomize the location of the display group, which should take both the star and the number inside. If we save it and test it, what you'll see is stars showing up all over the screen with the 0 inside them. So that's really the first tricky, if that's the right word for it, but the first tricky thing that we've done. So obviously we don't want zeros, but we're just tackling this one at a time. Here's the code we're working on. Now that we have that working, I'm gonna delete the commented outlines just so that I have less busyness on screen. All the extra stuff made the snippet look way more complex than it actually is. Okay, so the number. I want to change the number in the star. And so the first example is we're using a counter and counting up. So if we're going to do that, I mean, what's the first thing you know when I say we're going to do a counter, right? The first thing you should think is that I'm going to need a variable. I need a variable to do the counting. So I need to head to the snippets menu and create a new snippet. I'm going to call it app. How about app setup, because we may add some more stuff to this. I'm going to move it up to the top of the stack, option up arrow. I'm going to set up a counter. So I'll start it at count equals 1. And then inside of the snippet that we're working on, I'm going to rename it so it shows up a little better in the stack. It is, how about set up star. Okay, so it does not matter the order that you do this in because it's an independent action, but I want to count up and set the star's number. So actually I started it have 1 instead of 0. So I'm just in terms of getting the counting right. If I want the first star to be 1 and for it to count up from there, I need to actually set the star's number first and then do the counter second. So the text is object 7. So I'm going to say object 7 dot text equals count. And then I'm going to increment the counter. Count equals count plus 1. So let's save it, see what we've got. Okay, so now you should see your stars flung all around the display and they're counting up. It does introduce a bit of an issue, which is you can't see a lot of the numbers, right? So that's annoying. And so the way I fix that, I want to adjust this randomized fill color. So what I want to do is I want to make the colors of the star and the number kind of opposite or complementary. So in other words, if the star ends up being really dark, I need the text to be, the number to be white or something close to white so that there's the contrast so that you can see it. So I'm going to set a variable gray to be math.random. It may not make sense right this second while I'm doing that, but let me show you. I'm going to set the fill color to gray, and then I want to set object 7's text color. So we set object 7 text color with set text color, and then I'm not going to use gray. I'm going to use 1 minus gray, however you spell gray. So that should get me colors that are pretty easily visible, but let's see. So that did work pretty well. Let me rerun it. In fact, it worked so well, I'm thinking, you may be thinking this too, is you probably could use more than 10 stars, right? These are so cool. I don't know why I'm being so cheap with the number of stars. All right. So there's a couple things that are added in the chapter. One is putting the objects in a table, and then the other is doing math on the stars. So the math thing makes more sense if instead of counting, you're just giving it a random number. So I'm going to update this so that instead of what I just said, instead of counting, I'm going to give it a random number. So I'm going to comment these out just so that, again, if you're following along, you have those for reference and you can always back up. But I want the value of the star to be an attribute of the star. So I'm going to say star.value equals math.random. How about some number up to 25, and then I'm going to say object 7.text equals star.value. So this should give us randomly valued stars now instead of just a simple counter. All right. There's a couple things we want to add, but I do want to add a table because that's a big part of the chapter. So I'm going to head back to app setup, get into the snippet we just had. I don't need count anymore because I'm not doing a simple counter. I do need a table, and so I'm going to create a table called stars, and I initialize it to an empty table, and then I'm going to try to total up the values in the stars. So I'm going to create a variable total and set it equal to 0. So heading back to the snippet I'm working in, and again, I'm going to delete some stuff to make it easier to see on screen, but you do not have to delete anything in your code. Star value. All right, I'm sorry. I'm just watching the time and juggling kind of what I want to get to. I want to change course. Let's add the tap handler and do something fun with that. So I want to add the tap listener to the star display group. So I've selected the star display group, and I'm going to add a listener, and I'm going to add tap. I'm going to move the tap handler into the timer handler as well, and move it up to top. That way everything's grouped together. Each time the timer fires, it creates a new star, a new text display object, groups it together in a display group, and then adds the listener to the display group and gives it its own handler to handle taps on the display group. Let's test it first. Visually, I mean, there shouldn't be any difference on screen. The difference should be if I tap on a star, I should get information down here at the console saying, hey, you tapped on the star. So the stars are now kind of live. Okay, so instead of doing the table, I'm going to create the total just as a running total. So I'll say total equals total plus star.value. And then I'm going to display the total out at the console. So I'm going to say total equals dot dot total. Let's run that and see if that's working. We should get number at the console counting up based on the random value of each of the 10 stars. So this one totaled out at 152. What I want to do now is do something with that tap. So in a couple of the examples in the chapter, I allowed the user to tap these and then have something happen. So we want to be inside of the snippet that's inside the tap handler. So it's not enough to get tap information. What I do want to do is see, well, first off, can I figure out what the number of the star in that star was that was tapped? So I want to print tapped star value equals, and then it is event.target.value, because I called the attribute that contains the number the value. Okay, so you can do it at any point, but as soon as you want to, we should be able to tap a star and see the value out of the console. Just to clean this up a tiny bit, I want to get rid of this, but note I'm not getting rid of this. I actually want that, and I want it, in general, I do that as the last thing. The return true, what the return true does is says, okay, the tap's been handled. If you don't do that, then what you'll see is if there are stars on top of each other, it'll tap both of them, which is kind of cool, but in most games, that's not what you want. When you tap something, you want to just tap what you tap, not everything that also happens to be below it that you may not even be able to see. But we've got the value. What I want to do is I want to remove that star and also take its value off of the total. Okay, so that's two things. Let me write comments so that we know what we're doing. I want to deduct star value from total, and I want to remove star. So, well, deducting the number from the total is pretty easy. We already know the syntax to get to the total is event.target.value. So we would simply say total equals total minus event.target.value. And then to remove the star, the syntax is easy. It's I want to remove the target star that was tapped, which is event.target. And I want to call a function on it that's named remove self, which will take the star off screen. I did update the total, but then I also want to display the new total out of the console. So I'm going to say print new total equals ... total, close parenthesis. Okay. So the total for this run is 117. So if I take off the 7, you can see it's the tap's value is 7 and the new total is 110. I don't know why I keep putting extra space at the beginning. That's completely unintentional, but as I deduct values, you should see the numbers dropping bit by bit, And I'm hoping when I do that last one, I'll get down to 0. All right, awesome. Then let me try one last thing, which is let's add it to the table and then do something with the table. We're in this object for set up the star snippet. I want to add that star to the table. So to do that, I actually then do need a counter. Edit this app setup, and I'm going to call it n instead of count. So I'm just going to say n equals 1. This is going to be an index number for the table. Heading back to the snippet that we're working on, I want to say stars n equals star. And then I want to increment the counter. N equals n plus 1. This will not have any effect at all on the app unless I've introduced a syntax error. Just to double check, let me run it. We should get the exact same app. The difference is the stars are also now stored in a table that's called stars. So I have easy access to the data that's in all the stars. So if I wanted, for instance, to add a button that said display the average, I can now do that pretty easily. So let's actually do it that way. I'm going to add a widget. I'm going to add a really small shape button that says show stats. And I'm going to get it kind of out of the way, put it down here at the bottom, but I am going to make it a bit small so that it's not so much in the way of the beautiful stars. And let me stick with our grayscale theme, make it a grayscale button. So this has created a button. The button doesn't do anything right. The default code will just say you press the button. What I want to do in the button is calculate the average. So I want to be inside of the snippet that's on the button event handler. So this is object 14 in my stack. What I want to do is calculate the average. To do that, I need to calculate the sum and then divide it by the number of stars that are still in the table. So I'm going to use a separate variable. I'm going to call it sum then and say sum equals 0. And then I want to loop through the stars table. So I'm going to say for j equals 1 comma pounds stars do. I want to say sum equals sum plus stars j dot value. And then I want to print sum equals dot dot sum. That should calculate the sum of the stars and display that number at the console when you press the button. Again, unless there's a syntax error. So you should be able to do this at any point. Here we go. All right. So it does say sum equals 117. So that matches the total that we calculated by adding it up as we go. So this calculates the total now 2 different ways. But what I asked for was the average. So the average, to get to the average, you have to start with a valid total or sum. So now I have a valid sum, so I can calculate the average easily just by saying print average equals dot dot sum divided by pound stars. To see it in action. All right. All right. Hey, there's the average. So the total is 132. Obviously, in this case, since we have 10, we're just dividing by 10. Let me put the code back on screen. I mean, obviously, to make this more nice, we want to display the stats on screen. That's what I do in the keynote. To do that, obviously, I created a rectangle with a text display object that then I set to the to the average. So you got something that looks kind of like a pop-up window when you press the button that shows you the average. There is an issue which I have skipped over. If I have removed something from the table, I want to make sure then not to try to do anything with it. Here I'm trying to do something with a star in the table. I'm trying to access its value, right? But what if I tapped that star earlier and it's not there, right? That's a potential in our app because we added the tap listener, and that's what we do. So first off, let's just run it and do it. Let me just rerun it, and I'll tap a couple stars. Well, I'll show stats, and then I'll tap a couple stars, and then I'll show stats. So show stats, total's 106, average is 10.6, absolutely. I'm going to take off 12. New total's 94. The average is 10.6. So it's not really getting rid of the stars. And that is an issue that I can also show you how to fix. We're not getting the error because all I did was remove it using remove self. That removes everything associated with the display object as it is in default, but we added something to the display object. We added a value attribute. And so Solar2D is actually leaving that value attribute in place because it doesn't automatically get removed by remove self. So we're actually not getting to the point where the star is nil because the value is still hanging around. It's not on screen, we don't want it. It's screwing up our math. So I'm going to do two things. First off, I'm going to show you how to actually get rid of the star. That's in the tap support snippet, which is here. Here's where I removed self. I think the best way to implement this sort of functionality where we want to remove stuff on the tap is to use display.remove to remove it from the display, but then also to nil out any specific features we added, attributes that we've added, so that those also disappear. We've got, let me refresh it. When we tap to remove the stars, we subtract that value off of the total counter and then redisplay the total at the console. Show stats, on the other hand, runs through all of the stars that we've put in the table and calculates their new average based on just what's in the table, which is not quite right. We're still dividing by 10. If you watch, we've got 128, and I'm going to take a couple stars away. We don't have 10 stars now, but we're still dividing by 10 in the average. So we want to address that by just recognizing, first off, that the table still has these empty slots now. They've been nilled out, they're there, but they don't contain anything, but they still count. So what we really want to do is when we're calculating the average is we don't want to divide by the size of the table because that contains nil entries. Instead, we want another counter. So I'm going to say, how about num stars? And I'm going to set it equal to 0. And then only for valid stars will I say num stars equals num stars plus 1. So only in the case of a valid star do I increment this num stars variable. And then I'm going to divide by num stars instead of by pound stars, which contains the nil stars. So that should get us to, unless there's another mistake, that should get us to what we need. So here's a nice one with a total of 120. I'm going to take off 100, and that gives me a value of 100. But I'm not dividing by 10. I should now be dividing by 9, which gets us 11.11. All right, let me put that code back on the screen. This is now finally how to successfully remove, so let's say game objects from your screen when they need to be removed. If they're stored in a table, to also get them out of, nil them out in the table. And then how to deal with nil table values when we're doing math to get correct results and not also nil errors. The one thing this does not have is drag. And then the example in the book also shows you how to drag stuff into a collection bin of some sort. So the example in the book I would encourage you to look at is where we drag the galleons into the bank. So the one last feature that this could add is some sort of drag to remove feature. So we could certainly, if we wanted to, we could add to the display group, we could add the touch listener. And I'm going to also put that in with the other listener for the tabs. This in and of itself should give us the ability to drag the stars. Tapping them should still remove them. Dragging them should still drag them. We could include a target to drop the stars on. So let's add just a really simple target, which will be a simple circle. I'm going to put it up here and resize it down a bit so that it's not, huge. And then I'm going to add another text display object and put it up here. Started at 0. I do want to set the color on that so that we can see it. Anything but white I think will work. So what I want to do now is when the star is dragged onto the target, I want to also remove the star and increment that number in the middle. Okay, so we know how to handle this, right? When we're dragging the star, we're in this code, the touch handler. There's the default snippet touch drag support. This has been rewritten slightly by Drona Code to deal with the fact that we're not dragging a standard display object, we're moving a group of objects. So the moved phase is here, and what I want to do is check to see whether that new location or overlaps that target circle. So to write this code, I need to add that function, which is detect overlap, the first function. I'm going to move it up to the top, and then getting back to that snippet that I want to be in. I want to use that function. So I want to say if overlaps, let me add all the keywords and stuff. The two things I want to check are that target circle. Target circle is object 18. So I'll say if overlaps object 18 with, event.target, which is T. Then let's start out by saying print overlap. So that'll hopefully add the text overlap to the console when we overlap. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we're really close now. Instead of just printing overlap, I want to remove that star, but I want to get the value out of it first and add it to the counter, that red number, which is object 19. So I'm going to say, I don't know how I got over there, but I'm going to say object 19 dot text equals t dot value. And then let me test that. Oh, I can't see that. Okay. Yeah, so whatever star I drag up there, the target takes on that value, which is not quite what we want. I actually said let's do math on it. So what I wanted to do was, let's say toNumber object 19.text plus t.value. That should now accumulate the number in that target object. Let's have a look. So there's, oh yeah, for every pixel it overlaps, it's adding 9. So it is doing what we asked. Now the other thing we wanted to do though was we want to remove the target object. So I'm going to do the same thing we just did. I'm going to say display.remove target. I'm going to say t dot value, oh I gotta spell it right, equals nil. Those were the 2 steps we needed to get rid of it. I also want to remove it from the focus, which I got to spell right. I mean, actually, I think we want to do both of these. So let me copy this as well. This should remove the display object and also remove it from being the focus of the drag, since we're no longer dragging something that's not there. Let's have a look. This works. We should get a total. Hey, it's 120. That should go down as we remove them. I'm going to remove the ones that are over at the target. Okay, and then we should also get it to remove when we drag it to the target, and that should accumulate. Oh, I dragged 2 of them. That's interesting. But there's the result, and now we have an empty table. We have no sums and nothing to sum. So the average calculation is 0 divided by 0, which is not a number. So we'd have to add some additional code to make that appear correct. But that's an integrated example that gives you, I think, everything we covered in this chapter, which is dragging into something that we overlap with, handling stuff when an overlap occurs, putting things into a display group, and then using the display group as the focus of what we're doing, to tap, to drag, to add attributes to, adding these display groups to a table, and then using a loop to loop through the table to do math on values that are stored in in the table, in that value attribute in the table. All right, that's where I wanted to get today. We will start with physics next time.